Travis here with My Little Helper today, and we are going to do a bit of review. So today we find ourselves in Isaiah 19 to 21, which means we're about a third of the way through the book of Isaiah. Well done. But knowing that we're a third of the way through, I just want to stop and see if we've been paying attention. So we have a bit of a question for us today, and that is, what is the point, again, of the prophets? What is the point? What is Isaiah's main message and the main message of the prophets in general? So, is it A, doom and gloom, or is it B, promise and hope?
B.
We got one vote for B, and that's exactly right. That the main message of the prophets is actually promise and hope. Now, you may be thinking, how can that be? Because there's a lot of negativity in the message of the prophets, and that's certainly true. And that's exactly where we find ourselves in this section that we're reading today. God has basically brought a case against his people, the Israelites, earlier in the book, and now he's turned his attention to the surrounding nations. So he's condemning here Egypt and Assyria and the Philistines and Babylon. In all of these countries, he's bringing a case, and God's saying, you are in grave danger. I'm going to come myself, and I'm going to bring my judgment because you people groups, have been living out of sync with how I've called you and designed you to live. And you read through and you're like, whoa, this is pretty negative, right? There's a lot of judgment and condemnation. There's not a lot of good news. And so, when we're reading through the prophets, it becomes really easy to think that's what the main message is. That God is a God who's out to get people, and he's not very happy, and it's all just very negative. So turn or burn sort of thing. But actually, then we're missing what the main point of the prophets is. Even in this section, in chapter 19, for example, where God is condemning the Egyptians, he says this at the very end. After all this sort of criticism, he says, verse 19, "In that day there will be an altar to the Lord in Egypt, and a monument to the Lord at its border. It will be a sign and witness to the Lord Almighty in the land of Egypt. When they cry out to the Lord because of their oppressors, he will send them a savior and defender, and he will rescue them." Does that language sound familiar? That when the Egyptians find themselves in slavery and oppressed, and they cry out, God will hear them and send a deliverer. This is exactly what happened to the Israelites in Egypt. Now God is saying that for the Egyptians, I'm going to respond and listen the same way that I did for the Israelites. He goes on to say, at the end of this chapter, that there's going to be a highway built between Egypt and Assyria. These are two of Israel's greatest enemies at the time, and that they will go between one another and they will worship together, and that Israel will be just part of God's family, that Egypt will be my people, Assyria my handiwork, and Israel my inheritance, it says. And so it's this picture of not doom and gloom being the final word, but actually promise and hope, that God says these things because he wants to restore people and bring blessing to people, to bring deliverance to people and nations. And that God's case or his condemnation against people is merely to get our attention. That if we continue to go off on our own path and continue to rebel against God and worship false gods and put other things ahead of him and mistreat others and abuse people, that, well, that's not going to turn out well. And so God is desperately calling us to say, don't you know this is only going to end in destruction? So come and find me. But even then, that's not the end of the story. The end of the story and the point of the prophets, the main message is hope and promise. That God foresees a day when all people will turn to him. All people will trust in him and find wholeness and deliverance and healing, where everybody is invited to be part of God's family and experience the comfort and rest that means. And so you'll see these promises and these passages of hope scattered all throughout the prophets, but you have to pay attention and not let yourself get lost in all the sort of the case that God brings against the people or the nations, but to understand God is doing this because he loves us. He's slow to anger, abounding in love. He's gracious and compassionate, and he wants everyone to experience his goodness and be welcomed into his family. And so that's a reminder for us as we're reading through the prophets that we are meant to hold up a mirror to ourselves and ask, where do we lie currently? Are we people like the Israelites then and the nations then who have gone off on our own path and turned away from God? If so, pay attention. It's not going to end well. Or are we people like in this story who have turned back to God and trusted in God? Even when, like the Egyptians, we are the furthest away from God you could possibly be, but we've turned and found healing and wholeness in him again. If so, well, the promise is one for eternity, of future blessing now and forever. And that is where we want to be found, and that's the main message of the prophets. So, thanks for listening. Hope you have a great day, and we'll see you next week. Bye.